Welcome. I'm Carl Frederick, and I will be interviewing individuals for Kenosha Voices, an oral history project of the Kenosha County Historical Society in conjunction with Kenosha Community Media. I have worked in newspapers for more than 40 years as an editor and a reporter. 38 and a half of those years were at the Kenosha News. I am also a member of the Kenosha County Historical Society Board. We hope you enjoy these programs. I'm speaking with Ray Arbet, former Kenosha County Public Works Director. Thank you for joining me today.
Thank you for having me, Carl.
When did your family come to Kenosha?
So my dad moved to Kenosha from Wadsworth, Illinois in 1925, roughly the week he was born, August 30th, 1925. His folks bought a farm on 60th Street, just west of the interstate, on the north side of the road.
All right. And then what did your dad do?
My dad, unfortunately, both his parents were gone by the age of 15 for him, so he took over the farm and ran the farm. 1955, was fortunate enough to get hired by then Nash, eventually American Motors, and he worked both gigs. He ran the farm as well as worked at American Motors on second shift.
What kind of farm was it?
So it was a small farm, 60 acres was the original farm, and then in 1960 he was able to purchase the 60 acres directly across the street. So it ended up being a 120-acre farm, typical for back then in the 60s and 70s. You had a few cattle we milked. We had about 24 to 30 head of cattle that we milked, and we had another probably 50 head of young stock and beef stock. And then we raised crops on the farm to feed those cattle, and we're able to sell some of that stuff as well.
So it always was a dairy farm with cattle?
Dairy farm with cattle until 1974, and then we switched, got rid of the dairy herd. Pretty hard economically even then to have that small of a herd and make it work. And so we went into beef and crops, and that was it. And then continued that.
So your dad worked at American Motors,
Yep.
Second shift.
Yep.
Worked on the farm first shift.
Yep.
But with a dairy farm, you don't get to take a shift off. How did that work?
Yeah, so we, in the morning, he and my uncle who lived with us at the time took care of the herd and crops and stuff during the day. Then when Dad had to go to work, second shift, 3 o'clock I think is when he left. And then we'd come home, the bus would bring us home about 3:30, and the kids would kind of take over second shift on the farm, milking the cows with my uncle and running the cropland as well.
Okay. And so what did you learn on the farm?
A whole bunch about life, about mechanical stuff, about natural stuff, about chemistry, about physics, about music, because my mom was a teacher, a kindergarten teacher at Roosevelt, and had an interest in music, and she taught music as well. So yeah, there probably wasn't cooking. There really wasn't much we didn't learn on the farm because you had to pretty much be self-sufficient. So.
And was the farm self-sufficient?
The farm was self-sufficient. Yeah, we took care. We didn't have any outside help. The family literally ran the farm.
And the reason your dad worked second shift then at American Motors was because?
So because he wasn't fortunate enough to have an education beyond the 9th grade, he wanted to make sure, and my mom was on the same page, all 5 kids were getting a college education. So that was one reason, was to create enough income to support that goal. Also, the health insurance. He learned early on, the farm's it's a fairly dangerous place. And having good benefits, health insurance specifically at AMC, was a benefit for the whole operation.
Okay. So how much of what you learned on the farm did you carry with you throughout your work life?
I was blessed to be born on a farm, I'll just say that. So even though I switched my major a number of times in undergraduate school, started in engineering, went to political science, pre-law, ended up in business, and the engineering, though I never got a degree in engineering through grad school or any of that, the engineering stuff I was exposed to back at the farm was way more than sufficient to hold my own with any number of, whether I was talking to aerospace engineers, electrical engineers, fluid power engineers, mechanical engineers, construction engineers. It didn't matter. There was many things, all of those things I got exposed to at some degree, maybe not the aerospace, but pretty much all the other stuff on the farm.
Okay, and you said that your parents willed that all of the children were going to go to college.
Mm-hmm.
Where did you go to college?
So I started at Parkside in fall of 1978, and then I was there 2 years, and then I transferred to Carthage in, I think that was fall of 80. Yeah, fall of 80, and graduated from there in spring of 82.
Okay, so why did you switch from Parkside to Carthage?
So, I don't want to necessarily say anything negative, but I had just finished a business statistics class that I got the highest grade in the class, and I really didn't feel I learned anything. And I said, you know, I really want to make sure that what I get out of this education is something that really expands me in many ways. So the limiting thing was my dad wouldn't let me go away to school. I had to stay, he wanted me to stay home so I could help on the farm. So my other option, really locally at that time, was Carthage. So I went over there, checked things out. I really liked the program because of the liberal arts kind of approach to things. And I was able to double major then in, because of the classes I had taken, I was able to get a business major and a public management major when I graduated in 82.
Okay, and you said you were one of 5 children?
Yep.
Where do you fit?
So I'm number 2. I have an older sister who was a social worker. She's retired now, lives out in Wyoming. There's me. I've got twin brother and sister. Brother's a financial advisor, has his own financial firm in Sun Prairie, Madison area. The twin sister is co-owners of a hog farm out in Kenosha County on the west end. And then my little sister, they just retired from a dairy farm operation. The last dairy farm east of the interstate was in Summers. They just retired last year.
Okay, so you are in college, near graduation, or maybe graduated. What was your first job?
So I was fortunate enough to have really good internships. Part of the Carthage approach to things then, and I believe it still is this way, they really encourage internships. And so I did an internship my junior year at J.I. Case in what was then industrial relations, and then HR now, and then I did senior year an internship with Kenosha County it was actually, I think, labor relations and personnel is what it was called. I told you industrial relations last time, but it was labor relations and personnel, again, HR. I did that my senior year, and then that actually turned into a full-time job, that internship that I did January of 82. By the time I was working there part-time while I finished my last semester of school, and that turned into a full-time job.
And what job was that?
That was initially personnel technician, then personnel analyst is what I was. And you did, the county government was heavily unionized. I believe there was 9 unions representing all the different working groups. So I got to do contract negotiations, grievance procedure type things, recruitment, hiring, job descriptions, insurance, health insurance, workers' comp, safety programs, kind of a full range of HR type things.
And what would you say was one of the most significant things that you worked on while you were personnel analyst or technician?
Let's see. Personnel.
Who was your boss, and what did he?
So my boss was Brooke Coons, and he had gotten hired by the county as the new industrial labor relations director. Like 2 months prior to me approaching him to do an internship. He got hired in like November of 81, and he came from the city of Evanston and had been the director down there of personnel. So he had the full the full folder of HR skills. And he was a great boss. He could be controversial, but he was a great first boss. He mentored me well and let me make mistakes and figure stuff out, and he was a great boss. So the
hiring practices, was that something?
Oh,
that
that
you
was,
worked
yeah,
on?
the hiring practices, that was awesome. I got to work with an industrial psychology firm based in greater Chicago area called Police Consultants, Inc. They're at that point, they were most known for, they were the firm that worked with Scotland Yard when Scotland Yard in Britain made the transition from Bobbies only carrying nightsticks to now being able to carry deadly force. And they initially did that on a volunteer basis and found out the guys that wanted to carry the guns were the last guys you wanted to have carrying the guns after a series of mishaps. They hired these guys to develop a psychological testing process to screen out and really make sure you hire the best possible guys and get the guns in the hands of those folks that are most equipped to handle situations. We utilized them to develop custom testing processes for deputy sheriff back in probably 83, which was really cutting edge in terms of psychological testing.
Prior to that, how were deputies hired?
The traditional way, pretty much anybody was hired, and especially in county government. There was a fair amount of nepotism, because that's kind of just how county government prior to 1980, that was the way a lot of municipalities worked. So there was a fair amount of nepotism, and there was just interviews, and guys would provide a resume or fill out an application and get interviewed and get hired. There really wasn't a real structured process for a lot of those recruitment and hiring processes.
How much of a change was it, and was it difficult to find enough qualified people by going through this psychological process?
So the one thing that was, was a double-edged sword back then, 1982 when I graduated school, unemployment locally was in the, I'm going to say 12 to 14% range. It was bad. AMC was down, and some of the other manufacturing was down, so there was huge unemployment. So there was a lot of available people to apply for county jobs. County jobs were viewed very positively. They had a great pension, great benefit package. Pay wasn't necessarily quite as high as the private sector, but everything on par. Those were really plum jobs. So you had a wide range of folks applying for those jobs. Not folks that necessarily had degrees in police science or anything like that, but came from varied backgrounds. So having a tool that allowed you to separate. When we do a recruitment, we do a hiring list. So we'd recruit at a given time, take applications for maybe a month, and then have a testing process that would be in place, a basic testing process before we did the psychological testing part, a preliminary testing process, and that you'd sometimes have 500 to 800 people apply for those positions back then, which is completely opposite relative to what's happening today. Now it's very difficult to find folks for those jobs. Back then, you didn't have a shortage of people applying for jobs. You needed good tools to screen out and get the best ones for the particular job you were hiring for, especially somebody carrying deadly force. So that's what we did. We came up with those processes.
And that was viewed as quite successful.
Quite successful, yeah. From those 80s, I don't know if those testing processes, I know they're not exactly the same now, but I believe, let's say the children or grandchildren of those tests that we developed back then are still utilized in that selection process today. It's more important even today because of legal ramifications and so forth. But the groundwork for that stuff was laid back in 82, 83.
So how long did you work for the county?
So I worked in that department from 82, like May of 82 to July of 85. And then I was already in grad school at Marquette at the time in the MBA program up there. And one of my professors in organizational behavior had gotten a lead on a job that he referred me to. He referred me to a guy, and That was for a job as Industrial Relations Director for Acme Die Casting in Racine.
Why did you decide to leave the county?
I wasn't looking for a job. I've been very blessed. I've never really looked for a job in my whole life. This job came to me through one of my professors who I really trusted and liked, and I went through the process, and it was a great opportunity because I would now be, even though I was only 25 at the time, I was going to be the head of the HR department for this small company. It was only about 150 employees in Racine, a die casting manufacturer.
So you took that job.
I took that job.
And what did you do at that job?
So I was, again, kind of a one-person operation for a small company like that. Had an assistant, secretary type assistant that helped with stuff, but I was the one professional in the operation. And again, it was a UAW shop, so we negotiated labor contracts, handled grievances, safety programs. All the stuff I learned how to do at the county served me well in that role, in that director role, but now it was in the private sector, and it was in a manufacturing setting, so completely different.
Anything in the manufacturing sector that, for this company, that you did in addition to the personnel aspect of the company?
So again, as a small family-owned company, you kind of, if you saw something that needed fixing and you raised your hand, they'd probably let you go in there and try to fix it. So I got exposed to the engineering side in a much more intimate way. And the thing that happened there that was a life-changing thing was we had a consultant come in because manufacturing across the board in the US at that time, early 80s, you basically designed your stuff, made your stuff, and then did some quality checks at the end to make sure it was okay. That was the simplistic process that was in place. And at that time, the American car industry was getting whooped by the Japanese, who they never saw as a threat, and now literally Toyota, Nissan, Honda, all of them were building way superior products, and the American consumer was switching. And they kind of led the way, like, uh-oh, we got to do something. Well, they decided to embrace some of the stuff that Toyota and the other Japanese manufacturers had embraced 20 years prior from a guy named Dr. Edward Deming. He was the guy that created all this stuff. He came to the American manufacturers back in the 50s, post-World War II, and the American car industry was like, we don't need that stuff. We know what we're doing. So he says, okay, fine, I'll go talk to these Japanese fellas because they need to.
What was his idea?
So his idea was statistical process control, which laid the groundwork for the Toyota approach, the total quality improvement, and those types of programs that fall under that umbrella. And basically the concept was, and how we embraced this at Acme when I was there, we brought in a consultant, and the first day of that class, because in order for any of this stuff to stick to anybody, you got to convince them it makes sense. And so one of the first things he had us do was he passed around a bowl of, I don't know if it was jelly beans or beans, whatever it was, and he passed it around, and there's about 20 folks in the room, engineers and other manufacturing personnel, quality people, passed around, and everybody was, while he was starting to give us an overview using some slides, everybody was supposed to count the number, write it down, don't tell anybody what you came up with, and pass that thing around. And then when he was done with his overview, he said, okay, let's go around the room now and see how many, find out everybody should have the exact number, right? Because we just did an inspection process. Just like you guys do when you're making parts out there on the floor, you have final inspection after the guy already made the part, right? You have him check it out. It's the same process. So let's go around the room, see what, out of the 20 people, there's probably 3 people that had the same number that was the right number. The other 17 had all different numbers. Opened everybody's eyes to having human beings do even the most basic task, counting the jelly beans in the bowl. That is no guarantee that you're going to get a consistent quality all through the system. And that was a great exercise because it showed everybody that, yeah, you can't do it that way. So how do you do it then? Well, you start on the front end. You as you're designing that part, before you're even thinking about how you're going to manufacture it, as you're designing it, you're starting to identify key dimensions, key variables in that part as you're designing it, that if you have this one dimension, there may be 100 dimensions on that part, but if you get this one dimension based on how it's manufactured, the process that cuts the various things, various features, if you control this one, you are guaranteed that these other 5 dimensions are going to be dead nuts. Okay, so that's a key variable. We want to take that variable and we want to statistically map. Now we're going to put that part out on that machine and we're going to make a bunch of them. And we're going to see, we're going to just measure them. What's the variation on that part? So we run 10 parts, for simplicity, 10 parts. We're going to take that key variable and we're going to measure it on all 10 of those parts. And then we're going to say, okay, what's the variation in that, on that dimension that we're measuring? Okay, so are these all good parts? Okay, they're all good parts. Okay, then we can identify using statistical process control parameters around that nominal dimension. If it's supposed to be 1 inch right on the money, okay, 1 inch and 2 thousandths is good. 0.998 thousandths is also good. So we have a range of plus or minus 2 thousandths. As long as we're producing parts, and when we check that and they're coming in between those two, we know those other 5 dimensions are good on that part. We know that's a good part. Let her rip. We don't have to have anybody 100% inspecting all this nonsense at the end. We already know up front that's a good part based on our ability to control this and plot, take that data as we're making the parts, plot that. If we start to see a trend where, oh, this is starting to get up towards that upper control limit, let's look, oh, maybe that tool's worn. Maybe the temperature of the material we're working with has increased or decreased. These other variables, now you can do, you can drill into it to find out what's causing the variation. Variation is the enemy of a good product. You want consistency.
How long did you work there?
So I worked there from July 85 to, I believe it was fall of 89. And what happened then was John Collins had gotten elected county executive in Kenosha, and he wanted somebody to come help with organizing things again in a more formal way. I would call it an operations director is kind of the name of the position, but the actual name of that position was director of the Office of Management and Budget. That was the government name for that office, but basically an operations director. So I came back to the county then. That was my second stint, and I worked in a very small office all by myself with a little computer, and worked on special projects designed, or the goal being to improve efficiencies, get things organized so that we could have more efficient operations, higher quality operations in various areas.
Any particular project you can recall from that time?
So there were several that were that stick in my head. One was working with Judge Schrader. He was the one who proposed doing a work crew process, which had never been done in Kenosha County, having nonviolent offenders actually as part of their sentence, they would do things for the county specifically to help us accomplish things we wouldn't otherwise be able to accomplish. And so we set that work crew up. The other big thing that we did was we combined the city had a health department, the county had a health department. There was redundancies between those two things and gaps between those two things. And there was only one other county in the state at the time that had a county health department, which was Marathon County, Wausau. And so we went up there, talked to those folks, the health director at the time, county health director, and myself. And then basically we had to work to develop a way to merge those two departments, both operationally, and more tricky was the financial piece of it. Given that a fair amount of those services were exclusive to the city, or almost exclusive to the city, even though it was being moved to the county, how are you going to fund that in an equitable way? And so
how did these processes that were identified at the die casting company applicable to these projects?
So in that case, probably the the biggest thing was the way you would approach as part of a continuous improvement project, the same framework you'd use for a process improvement project in manufacturing, you can really apply that same framework and principles to this type of a project. So you want to identify the key variables, the key services in this case, the resources you've got, the cost of those things, and now start to identify where there's duplication, where maybe there's overlap, and you can start, you basically deconstruct that so that you can now identify the individual pieces and now rearrange them in a way that is more strategic. And that's what you do in continuous improvement in manufacturing, and that's kind of what was involved in that project as well.
And how long did you work for the county at that point?
So that, let's see, I went back in like fall of '89, and I believe I worked there till, I was only there a couple years. I think I left in either fall of '91, and then had an opportunity to go back into manufacturing in a small manufacturing setting again.
And what was that situation?
So that was an interesting situation in that through kind of family friends, my wife's sorority sister had married into a fairly prominent family down in Chicago, and her and her husband, they were married about 8 months longer than us. They decided, even though he worked for the family firm, he wanted to start, create his own kind of holding company. And they had gotten into, through her contacts, communications. They had a small radio station in the Chicago area. I think there was a small print newspaper. And then they wanted to get into manufacturing, and I said, well, I've always wanted to get back in there because I think there's work left undone there. And I found a small company, an ad in the Kenosha News, literally in the classified ads, that said small machine shop, family owned, owner retiring, wants to sell. So I checked with them if they thought this would be worth checking out. They said yeah, so I went and met the person, talked to him, who I'm still friends with. I just talked to him last week or the week before. He's 96 years old, and he's a phenomenal dude. Well, he's who I talked to. Bottom line is we put the thing together, they bought the company. I was going to run it as the operations person, general manager, and there were 2 people in the shop at the time, kind of a main person and then a machinist person. And it was a precision machining operation. And the thing that was attractive, even though it was very tiny, was that this was, again, early 90s, like 91. There were many companies that hadn't embraced computer-controlled CNC equipment for machining parts. This guy had the foresight, because of his background in machine tools, that the shop was completely computerized. It was all CNC. So even though it was tiny, he had all CNC machines, and he had these 2 guys that were skilled enough to run them. The other thing that they had a niche in is they only machined hard-to-machine alloys, stainless steels, and some other exotic alloys. So they did some defense work, they did a lot of food and beverage, some medical work. And so they had even though they were a tiny shop, they had some good little niche skills that they had. So that's what made it attractive. That company, that was that small, over the 12-ish years I was there, I think, that company grew from about 265,000. We grew it to just shy of $13 million in annual sales, and had picked up several medical companies along the way as customers, surgical instruments specifically. And then we did aerospace yet. We picked up Harley Davidson. We were a tier 1 supplier to Harley Davidson. So we expanded the portfolio of clients, and again, using a lot of the stuff I had learned from other, in terms of project management and engineering quality improvement stuff. We incorporated a lot of that. We also embraced automation. So we, at that place, we were again, even though it was a smaller operation, at the peak we were probably 35 employees. We had capabilities that you wouldn't find in shops that had 1,000 employees at that time. And one of the things I was most proud of was the one manufacturing cell we did when we had a bid on gaining this whole family of parts from a major customer out in the Rockford area, that they manufactured these in-house, and they were going through an internal audit to see what they should keep in-house as their core competency stuff and what are jobs they should farm out. They identified this particular family of parts as something they should subcontract for. We were one of, I think, 5 firms that bid on it, and the approach we took, because they used the company that actually owned the product, they had 2 people per shift on 3 shifts to keep up with their production in, I'll say, a manufacturing cell. There was very little computer equipment in that cell. So we came up with a cell to do all that work, and there was, I think, 12 parts in that family of parts. We came up with a manufacturing cell that made use of 1 person on 2 shifts, and we ran there were 10 to 12 hour shifts, but we ran those 2 shifts, and then we had guys that could come in on the weekend as well. So we ended up with about, where they had 6 people, we essentially had 2-ish people, and the rest was all automation. And there was robotics involved, there was vision systems involved, which were really cutting edge at the time, and this was around 2000. Vision systems now are pretty commonplace in manufacturing, but in 25 years ago, that was really cutting edge. And
How long were you there?
So I was there from 91 to, was it 05? I think it was 05 that I was there till. Yeah, and then 05, I left and went to, one of our customers wanted me to come to work for him, a medical surgical instrument company up in Grafton. And so I went to work for them. And again, incorporated a lot of the stuff I had learned at previous things. They were in a huge growth spurt as the population ages, the demand for back surgeries, hip surgeries, knee surgeries, shoulder surgeries, the demographics were starting to explode. And so any medical technology company that made surgical instruments and was in a good position. And that's what this company did. And so I went to work for them, and they had a single operation up in Grafton at the time, still growing, still pretty small, probably 20 employees at the time, I would say. And we, again, based on a lot of the automation and some of the stuff I had been exposed to and used in these other, at the other company, we went, I incorporated a lot of those same kind of things and exposed the company to those kinds of approaches to things, because they hadn't been doing any of that either. And probably the job there that I was most proud of was we were the second company in the US to buy a machine produced by Sagami Corporation out of Japan, which was an 11-axis machining center, meaning it literally could, while one part is in there, it could attack it from 11 different angles to get what you needed produced. And what that allowed us to do was for a specific family of parts that were very popular, becoming more and more popular because they were used in the minimally invasive surgeries, the arthroscopic type surgeries, which were really starting to explode. Well, that family of parts, when we produced it the way everybody else produced it, we would do our thing, and then we'd have to send it out for a special thing, and then it would come back in, and we'd send it to that place. And the bottom line is, from an order being taken till the time parts were ready to ship was about 3 months. Whereas this new machining center that had 11 axes, which took us a while to get set up because it's a fairly complicated machine. But once we got it set up, we could produce one of those parts, raw material coming in, and every 26 minutes, you could hold one of those in your hand fully complete. So the throughput, as you'd measure it, went from 8 weeks to 26 minutes. And it was, that's a game changer. And so that, even though that machine at the time cost about $750,000 to buy, and it took some convincing to the owner, understandably so, to do that, because it's a huge investment for a small company. As soon as we got it running, and then our changeover, because you could have so many of the tools necessary to go from this specific part to one of the other 20 parts in that family of parts, you could change over in minutes. So you could do all these things. Once he saw that, like after we got it really running, he looked at me and goes, okay, how quick can we get a second one of these? So it was that kind of success, and I believe that company's got 4 or 5 of those machines now.
And how long were you there?
So I was there from 05 to 08, and what happened there was I was literally sitting in the office, and
I mean, you're happy in your job.
happy in the job, in all the jobs. I'm still friends with pretty much all of these folks I've worked with over the years, including, like I say, the guy that's 96 years old and retired down in Florida now. So I'm sitting in the office, we're going through some stuff, I'm having a meeting with a few of the guys going over stuff, and I had been following, because I still live in Kenosha, I've been following what was going on locally, and at the time the county executive had been in trouble with some less than, let's say, fully high integrity dealings with some folks. He ended up in the federal penitentiary up in Minnesota, and they had to have a special election for a new county executive. And I knew my good friend Jim Cruiser was going to throw his hat in the ring for that, so I kind of followed what was going on, and then he won that special election. And that's about the time I'm sitting in the office having this meeting, and I had made a promise to Jim that if he ever needed any help with anything, do not hesitate to call me. So I'm having this meeting, we just opened up the shop, we got this machine running, we got all this stuff, good stuff going on, the company's expanding like crazy. I look down at the phone as it's ringing, and I see the caller ID is Jim Cruiser. And I'm like, I know what he's calling me for. So he called me, he said that they had some challenges, there was a bunch of things that needed attention in the public works area, kind of a technical engineering area. And but I had never worked in that area specifically, but he wanted me to come back and help with some of that stuff. And I said, okay, but I'm going to need some time. I got to make sure I can get everything settled here, hire my replacement, make sure these guys, because it's been a good company, they're doing good. So that happened, and probably the conversation with Jim was probably in May, probably right after he had the election in April. And then I didn't leave there until late that year, probably November or December. And that helped get everything settled, and then I came to work for the county, Public
And
Works.
that was 2008?
That would be 2008. Yeah, that's right. That was 2008. And so...
So what did he have you do?
So I came in as the Director of Public Works. And there was a number of things. There was a whole bunch of operational issues that needed to be addressed. But he also had a special project that they needed to expand the law enforcement. The public safety building was bursting at the seams. And there were new programs, new staff that they had to incorporate into the Sheriff's Department and the PD so they could continue to do their jobs effectively. And they needed more space.
So how did this processes that you worked on in the past affect the public safety building addition?
Okay. So when I was at both companies, actually both manufacturing companies I had been at there, the surgical instrument manufacturer as well as the manufacturer of the machining shop prior to that, we had constructed new facilities for both of those. And so I went through the design build process for both of those operations. Worked with architects, construction managers, construction GC folks, a wide range of construction-related technical people, electrical engineers, fluid power engineers, all that, civil engineers as well. So I'd worked with all those kind of folks in the manufacturing setting. So a lot of that stuff was transferable to now public safety building. Public safety building obviously has a specific bent for law enforcement and related things. The key to that is picking people that have done that kind of work. So we set up a process to select an architect, and that process was designed to make sure we got an architect that this isn't their first rodeo. And we got a great architect out of Milwaukee. That law enforcement was a big part of their portfolio. Brought them in and started that process. The other thing we did in that process was we changed the delivery model. Prior to that, for the previous 50 years or more, the county had always taken the approach, you design the building, you work with an architect, now you go out and you bid it, and you select a general contractor, and now you've set up a very unhealthy dynamic in a lot of cases between the contractor and the architect and some of the sub-consultants that are part of the process, the electrical engineers, the HVAC engineers, and all these other pieces that are part of a building like this.
So how did you change it?
So we changed it, so we went to the construction manager form of delivery model. And basically that model works where you work with an architect, but while you're working with that architect, you already hire a construction manager at the same time. So the selection process you go through for the architect, very similar process you go through for a construction manager. So we select both of those. We have those folks work together as the building is being designed. It's the same thing we did in manufacturing. We took product design and manufacturing engineering, design engineering and manufacturing engineering. You mush them together up front. So you don't just design something and say, okay, this is all built, okay, throw it over there, and now we're going to have you guys build it. Really? Well, you know, if you would have done this differently, we could have saved you a ton of money. And this doesn't make any sense. Yeah, it looks good, but that's not going to, we got to do this, 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 and this now. That's going to cost. So that's the old model. Everything was separated. We had these two guys, as the building's being designed now, so now you've got the construction guy reviewing everything before it's ready to bid. So that's the first advantage. You get all of that expertise meshed up front, and you get both of those entities singing out of the same hymnal before you even get near putting up the first beam or pouring the first concrete.
Well, what were a couple of the things that were really advantageous because you did it that way for the public safety building addition?
So there was a number of things we did. One of the big things, because that public safety building addition was a really complex building. Yeah, there's law enforcement in it. It was also going to house the county's IT center. So that's a whole nother animal unto itself in terms of the technical requirements of that kind of space. From a cooling standpoint, from a fire suppression standpoint, from a security standpoint. So that was a layer of that building as well. And what we did, there were a bunch of different things that we did in the process here, but one, we built a 3-story basement, first floor, second floor, third floor. If you count the basement, I guess it was 4 stories, but 3-story above ground building. And we knew full well that the middle section we were not going to use when we constructed that building in 2009, 2010. But we knew we'd never get a chance to build that space again. So we built that space knowing that at some point we're going to need to use that space, and this was going to be the cheapest time to do it. So we built out that space as empty. 3rd floor housed 2 critical functions, the IT center and another technology-based center, the dispatch operation. The dispatch operation at that point was literally kind of being held together with spit and baling wire because it was the original to that 1982 building, and this was, like I say, 2009. So they had way overgrown their space. So we moved the dispatch center and the IT center into that building, and all of the technical requirements for all that stuff are very niche and very high as far as the types of technical things that need to be addressed. But again, a lot of the stuff that I had learned on the technology side, whether I'm talking robots or vision systems or whatever, there's a lot of bleed over between some of the technologies that are used in IT and actually dispatch equipment as well. So bottom line is we engineered that building out, accommodated all that stuff. There's many cool things in that building, but one of them is the HVAC system. So again, you've got a 24/7 building. You've got huge heat generation from the IT equipment as well as the dispatch equipment. So you've got to have bulletproof HVAC in that. Traditional way to cool a building like that, you put a few different rooftop units sized based on what the square footage is, what the temperatures are, blah, 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 different things get plugged in the equation. You have a few different rooftop units. And the dilemma is, when one of those rooftop units goes down, the zone that it services is dead. Now you can open the doors and stuff to try to get some of the ambient temperatures from the other to get it, but no. So what we did, we were the first in the state on that building to use what's called a wall of fans HVAC unit. It is a single unit that sits on the rooftop, but contained within that unit, I believe there were 12 or 18 separate cooling and heating units. And they served, the way it was plumbed, you served the entire building. And things were designed in such a way that if you lost 2, 3, I think we could lose up to 20% of the fans and the units in that one unit. We could lose 20% and we could still maintain all the heat or all the cooling needs for the entire building. And that was the beauty of it. So you had these redundancies, multiple layers of redundancy in that one unit. And so that was something, again, I learned from manufacturing. There's no single point of failure. You have to have multiple. And this was a beautiful thing. So when we put it in, we were the first in the state. It was designed and manufactured out in California. They brought it in, they put it in, and as we were still installing it, there were hospitals in the area that were going through. Freighter was going through a building. They were always going through a building. There was a couple others. They came down to tour our facility because the manufacturer wanted them to see this, because hospitals would also be a great candidate for that kind of thing. And yeah, so that was that building project. There was a lot of cool stuff in there. The other thing that was great about that building project, even though we added, I don't remember the exact square footage now, I want to say maybe 40 to 50,000 square feet of building, very technical space given the IT stuff and the dispatch. And because of what we did on the front end to design for maintenance as well, we didn't add a single person on the maintenance staff, and we're able to completely manage that additional space without any additional help because of the stuff we designed into it to ensure all the maintenance activities could be done efficiently.
Oh, and was there a design to the floor of the new safety building addition?
So I think you might be talking about, there was a decorative kind of, in the lobby. You know, we didn't want to do anything that was over the top. It's a government building, but by the same token, you want this thing to be well made, and you don't want it to be a barn building. So in the floor, in the lobby of this public safety building, there's a mosaic, and it's not anything super elaborate, but it's nice. It's a nice architectural feature, and it's all tile, so it's very robust. Will be there for a long time, and the architects were adamant that you really want to do something like this because this is consistent with this kind of building. So we did that. I go, but here's the deal. I don't want to make this in order for this to look good, because people are coming in. This is going to be a heavily trafficked building. Wintertime, rainstorms, snowstorms, crud. I'm not going to have a maintenance guy stationed just in the lobby keeping this thing looking good. No, we can do stuff. I go, well, okay, let's talk about that. That vestibule before you get to the lobby, let's calculate how many steps a person has to take on different types of carpeting to see so that they can have 90+% of the stuff that's on their shoes removed before they get to that thing. Oh, okay, yeah. They dug up the data. We did the data. On different carpeting, we put carpeting in it's just like this carpeting. It's patches, so if something wears out, you just peel one up. You don't have to replace the whole thing. You peel it up, you put another one down. But it was designed specifically to remove the crud from your feet as you went through the building. And I think it was 12 steps, 11 or 12 steps is the average number needed to shake off 90+% of the stuff. So there's guys that calculate this stuff. And we incorporated that in. So now you go in that building and the lobby always looks, doesn't matter what time of day or night, it looks pretty darn good. If the maintenance guy hasn't been in there for a couple of days, it still looks pretty darn good. So those are the kind of things we incorporated into that.
And how long did you work with the county?
So I was there 2008, I think, till late 2012.
Why did you leave?
So then I got a call from a guy that was kind of a local, I'll call him a serial entrepreneur. He started, I think, 3 different companies. And all of them were very successful. And I knew him from when I worked in manufacturing. And he would at his son's soccer game one Saturday, and he was thinking about where his company was at because it now had grown to a point where it's starting to need, some things are starting to kind of get a little out of control. And he was daydreaming while he was watching his son's soccer game, and he still had my phone number in his cell phone, so he called me up and he says, hey, is there any chance you'd want to sit down and talk and la la la. And bottom line is, he wanted me to come to work. We had just finished the safety building, had made a lot of other improvements in the operations, so Jim gave me his blessing that I could leave. So I left and I went to work for another surgical instrument company. And I worked for them. They were growing leaps and bounds, but the processes were crazy. And what was there were many problems, but the biggest problem was this. They had some really good people there. That doesn't sound like that's a problem. No, it can be a problem because what happens is as they start to manufacture things and things go through multiple different processes internally, and something's wrong here a little bit, something's wrong here a little bit, by the time that thing gets close to being done, there's a whole bunch of things that it doesn't work right. But if you've got good people, they can take those things and they'll tweak this, tweak that, and now it works right. Okay, that's great. Except you never identified what the problem was in the first place, so it never got fixed. So breaking the culture of we'll do whatever it takes to get a good product out the door to that's really, really expensive, and we keep repeating the same mistake over and over again, which creates delays in all kinds of areas and additional costs. So let's time out, let's go back, get the design folks with the manufacturing folks up front, and again, establish those kinds of integrated total quality management kind of things you need to do, and control the processes, define and control the processes as they go. So if there is something that needs fixing, you fix it here as opposed to a guy with a pliers and a hammer fixing it over when it's ready to go out the building. And that was kind of the processes that we did there.
How long were you there?
So then I stayed there for a couple years. I think I was there from 12 to 14 or so, long enough that I like I say, I think made a number of process and system changes, got new equipment in there as well, automated some stuff, and then hired a guy that I knew was going to be my replacement. And so
And why were you looking for a replacement?
because I had gotten a phone call from Mr. Cruiser again, that they knew that they were going to need some help in reconstructing and adding on to the Brookside Care Center, kind of one of the most important buildings in the community, arguably. And I know they had hired at least one person to fill in the public works director role, and it didn't work out. So they were in need of somebody to come help with that. And so I worked with my successor at that company, got him all set up and going, and he was they did not miss a beat, and continued to grow and continue to grow, even though it's now gotten bought by an international company because it was being run so well. A French company now owns that company. And I went back to the county, and in the same role, working with the operations end of things, and then the special project I was going to lead was the Brookside Care Center renovation and addition. And we basically took, that building was built in 1995, and we completely renovated the existing building and then added on physical therapy, rehabilitation type building to do those services, as well as a community-based residential facility, assisted living. So it's kind of a continuum of care arrangement now. So if you go in and you just need PT, but you should be in-house because of the limitations you've got based on whatever surgery or other ailment you had, you can get that there. And then if you're healed up and you can go home, great. If you need to go into an assisted living thing now as a result of that, they have that there. And then at some point, if you need to move into a highly skilled nursing home type facility, you can do that all in one campus. And so that was a really, really important project, really good project. We had to first start it by taking down the old original Brookside from 1956, I think, that building. And that in itself, just taking that down and clearing that out was an interesting process. But we got that taken care of, and then got the table set to do the new building, and use the same approach, construction manager approach. We had hired an architect, did a selection process to find somebody that was skilled in and experienced in healthcare facilities and long-term care centers specifically, and then construction manager had the same kind of background as well, experience in that type of facility, got those folks together right on the front end, and had a very successful project there too. Yeah, it's a great facility.
And how long were you there?
So
Again.
then I stayed then at the county that time until I retired. I stayed there until 2022. I turned 62 in 22. Mr. Cruiser came to me about a year before. It would have been sometime in the summer of 21. And he came out to meet with me, which was unusual because usually I went downtown to see him. He came out to the county center, and I was worried that he was going to tell me he was going to run for another 4 years. But he actually came out to tell me, and he was scared that I was going to be disappointed that he wasn't going to run, but I actually told him he took a great burden off my shoulders, because then when he told me he was going to not run again, I said, Jim, you just gave me permission to retire myself, so thank you very much. And so he retired April of that year when the new county executive was in place, and I was done in July of that year.
And what made you decide to retire? You said you were 62 at the time. Why did you retire from?
I got a long bucket list of things. I got a long bucket list of stuff to do. So I've got cars to restore. I've got new martial arts to learn. I've got traditional Native American bows that I make for hunting. Travel, family, kids, grandkids now starting. So I didn't want to get to a point where I couldn't enjoy those things, and some of them are physically taxing, so I wanted to make sure I got a head start on them, and I was in good health, so I said, let's do this. We could do it financially, so we did it, and my wife's retired, I'm retired, and we're starting to do all those things now, and it's a blast. Still do some limited consulting in both manufacturing, construction, civil stuff as well. Folks need help with stuff, but I'm not aggressively pursuing any of that because to be honest, I totally love it, but I don't have the time because I got other stuff that I'm working on, so all good.
Well, thank you for joining me today.
Thank you for having me, Carl.